Welcome to Politics Nation. I'm Al Sharpton. Tonight's lead, the questions continue for Mitt Romney. Late today, Mr. Romney gave interviews to 5 different networks, including NBC, in an effort to diffuse the controversy over Bain Capital. For years, Romney has been saying he left Bain in 1999 and that he couldn't be blamed for the thousands of workers laid off by Bain in the years after that. His 2011 financial report says, quote, he retired from Bain Capital on February 11th, 1999. Quote, since February 11, 1999, Romney has not had an active role with any Bain Capital entity and has not been involved in the operations of any Bain Capital entity in any way. Romney signed this document personally. But today, new information is emerging that tells a very different story. Building on what we've learned earlier this week, documents given to a Massachusetts commission in 2002 show Romney still had full ownership in at least 6 Bain entities while he was in Utah managing the Olympics. And the commission found Romney was still serving on the boards of companies that had Bain ownership stakes in Staples, Marriott, and LifeLock. All this paperwork show Romney still owned Bain 3 years after he says he retired from the company. Now, his opponent in 2002's governor's race, Shannon O'Brien, hammered him on exactly this point.
The fact is you were still signing documents as CEO of the company while you were away. And as a matter of fact, in the summer of 2001, when you were leaving the Olympics, you actually made a statement in the paper that in the summer of 2001, you were finally relinquishing 100% control of your position within Bain.
Romney's answer then was the same as his answer now. Deny everything.
I was out in Utah full-time. I had no responsibility for management at Bain Capital. I was not running Bain Capital and am therefore not responsible for the actions of Bain Capital when I left.
Now, again, all this matters because Romney has been trying to duck responsibility for the thousands of people who were laid off by Bain Capital during those years. These are the people whose voices we're hearing in TV ads released by the Obama campaign.
It was like going to war every single day. They were starting to try to figure out ways to eliminate jobs.
We started having quality issues at that plant.
They weren't concerned about your health. It was like working in the sweatshops of the 30s.
It was like a vampire. He came in and sucked the life out of us.
They made as much money off it as they could, and they closed it down. They filed for bankruptcy without any concern for the families or the communities.
Bain Capital was the majority owner. They hired the management. Mitt Romney was deeply involved in the influence that he exercised over these companies.
Now, these voices are why Mr. Romney's time at Bain matter, and we need to get to the answers. Joining me now is Chris Hayes, host of Up with Chris Hayes here on MSNBC. He's also author of the new book, Twilight of the Elites. And David Bernstein, political reporter for the Boston Phoenix, who's covered Romney for a long time. Now, he actually broke this story back in 2007 when he wrote that Romney was still listed as Bain's owner long after he supposedly left the company. Thank you both for joining me, first of all.
Thank you.
David, let me start with you. How can Romney own a company but not have any responsibility for it? Is that possible?
Well, sure, it's possible, and he does say that. What's been kind of odd is that he and Bain are both now sort of saying that he totally split ties back in February 1999, and that it was just paperwork and the complexity of the corporate structure and the suddenness of him leaving that was why it doesn't appear that way on paper for another 2.5 to 3 years. And that's clearly not true. As a matter of fact, and this was referenced in that clip you showed of Shannon O'Brien in that debate, but in August of of 2001, 2.5 years after he left for Utah, he held a press conference. Mitt Romney held a press conference to announce the decision that he was going to cut ties with Bain and leave the company, not come back to the company after the Olympics. That was 2.5 years after.
So he held a press
clear
conference 2.5 years after the date they're saying now he left to announce he was finally leaving.
Yes, to say that he was cutting ties and that he would become a passive investor in the company but have no more actual operational control and so forth. And then that was sort of finalized by the following year, but it was put in motion at that time. So there's still big questions about how much was he involved? Did they, consult with him, ask him? Did he have authority to do things that he could have done? Could he have called up and stopped deals from going through and so forth? We don't know how much of that was going on, but he certainly was. I don't think there's really any dispute on this fact that you can have, that he was the owner, CEO, controller, and was essentially on sort of an informally defined leave to come back when he wanted to.
Now, Chris, you've been following this closely as well. Whether or not he had operational hands-on management or not, we don't know. But we do know he signed the SEC filings. And you don't sign the SEC filings in advance 2 or 3 years. So he was actively every year signing new filings.
Yeah, exactly. Every year they file with the SEC. He's vouching to federal regulators saying, I'm the CEO of this company. What's so bizarre to me is that they find themselves now in this terrible situation where he seems to be both simultaneously away from the company and running the company at the same time in different filings to different groups of people. There are some documents that were released to Fortune in which they're telling investors, Mitt Romney isn't running the show. They're telling the federal government he's still the CEO. All of this has been done so that he has some plausible deniability in this deal with GST Steel, which fired a lot of folks, sent the jobs overseas. Right. When, in fact, what GST Steel did between 1999 and 2002 wasn't that different from anything Bain did in the years when Romney was actually running Bain. Right. I mean, Bain was doing what Bain was doing, which was in some cases bankrupting companies, in other cases outsourcing jobs, because that's what private equity companies do. He was doing that the whole way through. They're now caught in this trap that they've laid for themselves by trying to make this fine-grained distinction between what Bain did after 1999 and what it did before it.
And it was, in effect, doing the same things.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you look at the AMPAD plant, which is another big plant that has been featuring in ads in every opponent that's ever run against Mitt Romney, that was happening while he was actually there. Outsourcing investments were happening while he was actually there. I mean, Bain Capital was there to use leverage to make a lot of money for its shareholders and its managers. And wherever the chips fell in that process, that's what happened. That's clearly what they were doing. That was the MO the entire time. It's just so ridiculous for him to try to create this very fine-grained distinction between bad Bain activities in 1999 to 2002 and good Bain activities before that.
But see, it's important. He needs the distinction because he's trying to say he was not involved in laying off workers. He was not involved in outsourcing. And he says I ought to be judged with my business experience, not governor of Massachusetts, not the Olympics. I ought to be president because look at what I can do in business. And when we started looking, he started doing a political moonwalk. David Bernstein, you wrote in 2007 that although he claimed to have severed his ties with Bain, SEC documents show that Romney retained 100% operational ownership of the company and its subsidiaries through 2001. And in parentheses, the campaign insists this was just a paper formality. Now, the fact is, if he's signing this to the federal government and there are things that have gone on with the company, isn't he signing as the CEO and in effect to the federal government representing that he, in fact, is responsible as CEO, and whether he had direct management or not, he's the guy signing the report?
Yeah, I mean, you would think so. And there are certainly situations where you can claim to be the owner, but not necessarily directly involved in some of the management. But he was also CEO and president. One thing that I would say also is, and I take Chris's point, I think he's completely correct about some of these outsourcing issues. It doesn't really matter where you draw the line. I think that the problem that has Romney and his team trying to draw that distinction is that there are other things that are likely to be brought into the conversation, some of which are in that article that you pointed to, if I can just brag about my article, point people to
Knock
it.
yourself out.
For instance, there's a deal with a company called DDI, right, which ended up being investigated by, as part of an investigation that Lehman Brothers paid over $1 billion to settle with, having to do with allegedly Bain people putting pressure on one side of the Lehman Company to jack up their rating on DDI, which Lehman was also handling the banking for the IPO, and one of those kinds of deals. Romney's name and signature are on those documents of selling Bain shares in that, but he has always maintained I had nothing to do with that because that took place while I was gone, even though his name is on it, and so on, and things, conflict of interest issues and so forth that could come up and are likely to come up as this goes along. He'd like to draw that distinction now before those become issues.
Well, Chris, I mean, clearly there's a reason for him to try and distance himself. But again, I repeat, the reason this is important. We're talking about people's jobs. We're talking about a man that wants to be president of the United States, whether he was outsourcing. And we're talking about a man who has clearly been dealing in the Cayman Islands and in Bermuda with his own money. He's the one that told us, judge me by my business acumen, my business experience. He sent us to Bain. We didn't go there. We would have gladly asked him how he, as governor of Massachusetts, came in almost last in job creation. But he guided us to Bain. Now we're there. There's too much pain in Bain for him.
It's always been, I think, a dubious argument to say that running a private equity company gives you the tools you need to create jobs from the perspective of the federal government. And just the enterprises are so different in so many ways. The values, the stakeholders, who you listen to, who you are dependent upon. I mean, they're just such different enterprises, such different undertakings. It's always seemed to me such a dubious argument. But it's also opened him up to the thing. This is the thing. I mean, the irony of this, and Dan could probably speak to this. I mean, this is the thing that this has been every campaign that he's run. Right. This is what they have attacked him on. I mean, this is every single time that he's run for office. Right. This is, I mean, it's so funny to see these attacks being played in the gubernatorial race in which he was successful. Yeah. They came up in Ted Kennedy's race in '94, and again and again.
So surprised. Chris Hayes and David Bernstein, I've got to let it go there. Thank you for joining me tonight. And David, let me tell you how you have a great weekend. You get on a treadmill, you get your tea, and you watch Up with Chris Hayes on Saturdays and Sundays from 8 to 10 a.m. That's what I do. We have breaking news ahead. Mitt Romney responds for the first time to the Bain controversy tonight. Plus, the strategy behind all the Bain attacks leads to one big question. Why is he hiding his tax returns? And 10 years ago today, something big happened under George W. Bush, and we haven't looked back since. But it's not an event to celebrate. You're watching Politics Nation on MSNBC.